Christina Lopez, had worked at Save Mart in Seattle's Greenwood neighborhood for 8 years. She'd started as a bagger at 26, worked her way up to cashier, and had settled into the rhythm of retail work. It wasn't glamorous, but it paid bills, and she liked interacting with regular customers. Tuesday afternoon shifts were usually steady, but not overwhelming. Christina was scanning items for her third customer of the hour when she noticed the man and elderly woman approaching her register. The man was in his late 40s, wearing khakis and a button-down shirt, looking like any professional on a grocery run. But it was the elderly woman with him that made Christina pause. She was tiny, maybe 5 feet tall, and alarmingly thin. Her clothes hung loose on her frame, like she'd recently lost significant weight. She moved slowly, uncertainly, keeping her eyes down. Most striking was the fear in her body language. She walked slightly behind the man, hunched over, flinching when he made sudden movements. Christina had seen enough domestic violence situations. Her own mother had endured an abusive marriage to recognize that particular brand of fear. The man dumped groceries onto the conveyor belt while the elderly woman stood silently beside him. Christina started scanning items, watching them peripherally. "Did you remember to get the right milk this time?" The man snapped at the woman. "Last week you got whole milk when I specifically said 2%. Do you ever pay attention?" The woman's voice was barely a whisper. "I'm sorry, Richard. I tried." "You always try and you always fail." Richard cut her off. "I don't know why I even bring you anymore. You're useless." Christina felt anger rising, but kept scanning items. It wasn't unusual to see family members being rude to each other in stores, but something about this interaction felt worse than ordinary rudeness. Richard grabbed a box of crackers from the woman's hands roughly. "What are these? I didn't tell you to get these. Why are you adding things we don't need?" I thought they were on sale," the woman said, her voice shaking. "I don't care if they're free. I decide what we buy, not you. You don't get to make decisions. You've proven you can't be trusted to make good choices." He threw the crackers back toward the shelves, not bothering to return them properly. The elderly woman shrank back, her hands trembling. Christina finished scanning and gave the total. "That'll be $147 wallet," still berating the woman. "This is why our bills are so high. You constantly waste money on things we don't need. I should just leave you at home where you can't cause problems." As he paid, Christina got a closer look at the elderly woman. She was painfully thin, her cheeks hollow, her wrists like twigs. She had bruises on her arms, old ones, yellowing and fading. Her hair was unwashed, stringy. She looked malnourished and neglected. But what struck Christina most was the expression in the woman's eyes when she briefly looked up. Pure terror. And something else, a silent plea. "Help me." Christina made a split-second decision. As she handed Richard his receipt, she spoke directly to the elderly woman. "Ma'am, are you okay? Do you need anything?" Richard's head snapped toward Christina, his eyes suddenly hostile. "She's fine. She's my mother, and she's perfectly fine. Why would you ask that?" "She just looks unwell," Christina said, trying to sound casual despite her racing heart. "I wanted to make sure." "She's old," Richard interrupted. "Old people look unwell. It's none of your business. Come on, mother." He grabbed the woman's arm, not gently, and steered her away from the register. Christina watched them go, noticing how the elderly woman stumbled, how Richard didn't slow down or help her, how she looked back once at Christina with that same desperate expression. Christina's stomach turned. Every instinct told her that woman was being abused. But what could she do? She couldn't leave her register during her shift. She couldn't accuse a customer of abuse without evidence. She couldn't follow them, but she couldn't do nothing. Christina pressed her call button, signaling her manager. Within a minute, Tom Harris approached. "What's up, Christina? I need you to cover my register for 5 minutes. Emergency bathroom break." Tom looked annoyed but nodded. Christina clocked out temporarily and hurried to the front of the store. She could see Richard and his mother loading groceries into a silver Honda in the parking lot. Christina pulled out her phone and took a photo of the license plate. Then she went back inside and called 911. The 911 operator listened as Christina described what she'd witnessed. "I'm a cashier at Save Mart on Greenwood Avenue. I just served a customer, a man in his late 40s with his elderly mother. He was verbally abusing her in the checkout line, calling her useless, telling her she can't make decisions, treating her terribly. But it's more than that. She looked terrified of him. She's extremely thin, like she's malnourished. She had bruises on her arms. She looked at me like she was begging for help but couldn't say anything. Did you get names or any identifying information?" He called her mother. "He paid with a credit card. The name on my receipt says Richard Brennan. I got their license plate number." Christina read it off. "Okay. I'm dispatching an officer to take a report. Are they still at the location?" "No, they left a few minutes ago. But I have the plate number and the receipt with his name." A Seattle Police Patrol officer arrived within 20 minutes. Officer James Park took Christina's statement, her description of what she'd seen and heard, and copies of the receipt and her photo of the license plate. "You did the right thing calling," Officer Park told her. "What you described could be elder abuse, financial exploitation, emotional abuse, possible neglect based on her malnourishment. We'll follow up." He ran the license plate. The car was registered to Richard Brennan, address 15023 65th Street, NE. The elderly woman was likely Margaret Brennan, Richard's mother, age 78. Officer Park contacted the Elder Abuse Unit at Seattle PD. The case was assigned to Detective Michael Foster, who specialized in investigating abuse and exploitation of elderly victims. Detective Foster called Christina that evening. "Miss Lopez, I'm following up on your report about Margaret and Richard Brennan. Can you walk me through exactly what you observed?" Christina described the interaction again. Richard's cruel words, Margaret's fear, her physical condition, the bruises, the malnourishment, the silent plea for help. "In your judgment, did Mrs. Brennan appear to be in immediate danger?" Christina thought carefully. "She appeared scared of her son. She appeared to be neglected, too thin, bruised, dirty. I don't know if there's immediate danger, but I know something is very wrong. She looked at me like she wanted help, but was too afraid to ask for it directly." "Okay. Based on what you've described, I'm going to conduct a welfare check at their residence. I'll also look into their history, any prior reports, medical records if I can access them, financial records if there's suspicion of exploitation. Thank you for reporting this, Miss Lopez. Most people wouldn't have noticed or wouldn't have cared enough to call." Christina hung up feeling anxious. What if she was wrong? What if Margaret really was just old and frail, and Richard was just a stressed caregiver having a bad day? What if Christina had just caused trouble for a family doing their best in difficult circumstances? But she couldn't shake the image of Margaret's eyes, the terror, the plea for help. Christina knew abuse when she saw it. Detective Foster conducted preliminary research before approaching the Brennan home. Richard Brennan, age 49, worked as an accountant. His mother Margaret had been widowed 12 years ago and had been living with Richard for the past 5 years. There was one prior call to the address. 3 years ago, a neighbor had reported loud arguing and sounds of things breaking. Officers had responded, spoken to Richard, who'd explained his mother had dementia and sometimes became agitated. Officers had documented the call but hadn't found evidence of abuse at that time. Foster pulled Margaret's medical records with a warrant. She'd been a patient of Dr. Susan Chen for 20 years. The records showed Margaret had mild cognitive decline but not severe dementia. More concerning were notes from appointments 5 years ago showing she was a healthy weight at 122 pounds. Her most recent appointment 2 years ago showed her weight at 108 pounds, a loss of 34 pounds. Dr. Chen had noted concerns about possible malnutrition and had recommended follow-up. There was no record of follow-up appointments. Foster called Dr. Chen. "I'm investigating potential elder abuse. Margaret Brennan is your patient. Can you tell me about her?" Dr. Chen's voice was heavy with concern. "I've been worried about Margaret for years. Her son controls all her medical care. He started accompanying her to appointments 5 years ago and wouldn't leave the room. Margaret became very quiet, stopped speaking up about symptoms or concerns. Then 2 years ago I noticed significant weight loss. I told Richard she needed better nutrition and follow-up appointments. He said he'd take care of it, but she never came back. I called several times but Richard always answered and said she was fine, didn't need to come in. I suspected something was wrong but didn't know what to do." "Did you ever suspect abuse?" "Yes, but I had no proof. Margaret wouldn't speak freely with Richard in the room. She looked fearful but wouldn't say anything when I asked if she was okay. I should have reported my concerns, but I wasn't sure and I didn't want to make things worse for her if I was wrong." Foster heard the guilt in Dr. Chen's voice. "Doctor, based on what you've told me, I'm going to conduct a welfare check. If you had concerns about her well-being and safety, those are valid indicators. Something might be wrong." Armed with this information, Detective Foster went to the Brennan residence the next morning. He brought Officer Park and a social worker from Adult Protective Services, Linda Morrison. Richard answered the door, immediately defensive. "What is this about?" "I'm Detective Foster with Seattle PD Elder Abuse Unit. This is Officer Park and Linda Morrison from APS. We've received a report of concern about your mother's welfare. We need to speak with her." Richard's face flushed. "This is ridiculous. My mother is fine. Someone called you because of what, exactly?" "We've received reports of concern about Mrs. Brennan's physical condition and treatment. We have a legal obligation to investigate. Is your mother home?" "She's resting. She doesn't need to be disturbed by this nonsense." "Sir, we need to see her. We can do this cooperatively, or I can obtain a warrant. Your choice." Richard stared at Foster with barely concealed hostility, then stepped aside. "Fine, but this is harassment." They entered the home. It was neat and clean, nothing overtly concerning. Richard led them to a small bedroom where Margaret sat in a chair by the window. Foster was struck by how frail she looked. Christina's description had been accurate. Margaret was extremely thin, her clothes hanging loose, her face gaunt. She looked up at them with fearful, confused eyes. "Mrs. Brennan, I'm Detective Foster. I'd like to ask you some questions. Is it okay if we talk privately?" Richard started to object, but Foster cut him off. "Sir, I need to speak with your mother alone. Please wait in another room. I'm her caregiver. I have a right to be present." "No, you don't. This is an investigation. Please step out." Richard left reluctantly, his anger palpable. Linda Morrison stayed with Foster to provide support for Margaret. Foster sat down to be at Margaret's eye level. "Mrs. Brennan, we're here because someone expressed concern about your well-being. I'd like to ask you some questions. First, are you safe? Are you being hurt or threatened?" Margaret's hands trembled, her eyes filled with tears. I'm fine. Richard takes care of me." "Mrs. Brennan, you've lost significant weight. Are you getting enough food?" I'm not very hungry anymore. Old people don't eat much." Foster could see the fear in her eyes, the same fear Christina had described. "Mrs. Brennan, it's okay to tell me if something's wrong. We're here to help you." "Are you afraid of Richard?" Margaret's facade cracked. Tears streamed down her face. "Please don't make him angry. He gets so angry when I cause problems. I don't want to make trouble." "What happens when Richard gets angry?" Margaret looked toward the door, terrified he might hear. He yells. He says terrible things. Sometimes he won't let me eat if I've done something wrong. Sometimes he locks me in my room. Sometimes She touched her arm where bruises were visible. "He grabs me, hard. I bruise easily now." "How long has this been happening?" 5 years, since I moved in. It wasn't always this bad. At first it was just, he was controlling, told me what to do, made all my decisions. But it got worse. He's angry all the time now. Angry at me for being old, for needing care, for existing. Linda Morrison gently asked, "Mrs. Brennan, do you want to stay here, or would you like help finding somewhere else to live?" Margaret looked torn. "I don't have anywhere else to go. I don't have money. Richard controls everything, and he's my son. I raised him. I can't just abandon him." "You're not abandoning him," Foster said firmly. "He's abusing you. Physical abuse, emotional abuse, financial exploitation, neglect. That's not acceptable regardless of your relationship. We can help you get somewhere safe. Would you like that?" Margaret sobbed. "I'm so scared, but I can't live like this anymore. I'm dying here, slowly. I can feel it. Please help me." Foster and Morrison documented Margaret's statements and took photos of her bruises, her malnourished state, her living conditions. Then they went to speak with Richard. Detective Foster found Richard in the kitchen, pacing angrily. "Your mother has disclosed abuse, Mr. Brennan. Physical abuse, emotional abuse, financial exploitation, and neglect. We're removing her from this home immediately." Richard's face went red. "That's insane. She's confused. She has dementia. She doesn't know what she's saying. Her doctor says she has mild cognitive decline, not severe dementia. She's perfectly capable of reporting abuse, and her physical condition supports her statements. She's severely malnourished. She has bruises consistent with being grabbed forcefully. Her medical records show concerning weight loss and lack of follow-up care. I'm her caregiver. Do you know how hard it is to care for an elderly parent? She's difficult. She doesn't eat enough. She falls and bruises herself. I do my best, and this is how I'm repaid." Accused of abuse, Linda Morrison stepped forward. "Mr. Brennan, your mother says you withhold food as punishment, that you lock her in her room, that you grab her hard enough to leave bruises, that you verbally abuse her. Those are not acceptable caregiving practices." "She's lying," Richard shouted. "Or she's confused. She doesn't understand. We have evidence that corroborates her statements," Foster interrupted. "We're taking her into protective custody. We'll be conducting a full investigation. If you interfere with her removal, you'll be arrested for obstruction." Richard looked like he wanted to physically fight but restrained himself. "This is bullshit. I've dedicated 5 years to caring for her. I gave up my life, my privacy, my freedom to take her in when no one else would. And this is my thanks." "Your mother didn't ask to be abused as payment for your care," Foster said coldly. "If caregiving was too burdensome, there were other options: assisted living, in-home care services, other family members. Abuse is never justified." They arranged emergency placement for Margaret at a secured facility that specialized in elder abuse victims. Margaret was terrified but also visibly relieved as they helped her pack essentials and escorted her from the house. As they left, Margaret looked back at Richard, who was standing in the doorway radiating fury. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "I'm sorry for being a burden." "You're not a burden," Linda told her firmly. "You're a human being who deserves dignity and care. You have nothing to apologize for." Once Margaret was safely away from the house, Foster returned to speak with Richard again. "Mr. Brennan, based on the evidence and your mother's disclosure, I'm placing you under arrest for multiple counts of elder abuse." Richard was handcuffed and taken into custody, protesting the entire time that he was being persecuted for being a devoted caregiver, that his ungrateful mother was lying, that the system was destroying families. Foster had heard it all before. Abusers always had justifications. Margaret Brennan spent her first night in protective custody at Evergreen Elder Care, a specialized facility for abuse victims. She had her own room, regular meals, and medical evaluation. The medical exam was sobering. Margaret was severely malnourished with a BMI of 16.8, dangerously underweight. She had vitamin deficiencies, dehydration, and multiple old injuries, healed fractures in her wrist and fingers that had never been properly treated, suggesting past physical abuse. "Mrs. Brennan, when did you break your wrist?" Dr. Andrew Kim asked gently. "About a year ago. I fell." Richard said it wasn't bad enough for the hospital, that I was being dramatic. "It hurt for months. It was broken and healed improperly without medical treatment. Same with these fingers." "Mrs. Brennan, not treating injuries is medical neglect. Combined with food deprivation, physical abuse, and emotional abuse, you've been subjected to severe ongoing
maltreatment. Margaret cried. I thought it was normal. I thought this was just what it was like to be old and dependent. I thought I deserved it for being a burden. You didn't deserve any of it, Dr. Kim said firmly. Age doesn't make abuse acceptable. Dependency doesn't justify mistreatment. You deserve dignity, care, and respect. That's what we're going to provide here. Over the following days, Margaret slowly began to understand that what she'd experienced wasn't normal caregiving stress. It was systematic abuse. Her therapist, Dr. Rachel Foster, specialized in trauma recovery for elderly abuse victims. Elder abuse is often hidden because victims are isolated, dependent, and ashamed. Dr. Foster explained, you felt you had no options. You felt you deserved poor treatment because you needed care. Those are common feelings abuse victims experience, but they're not true. You always deserved better. Margaret gradually opened up about the 5 years of abuse. How it had started subtly, Richard making all her decisions, controlling her money, limiting her contact with friends. How it escalated, verbal cruelty, food restriction, physical violence, isolation. How hopeless she'd felt, how certain she was that no one would believe her, how guilty she felt for causing problems for her son. I thought about dying, Margaret admitted during one therapy session. I thought everyone would be better off. Richard wouldn't have to deal with me anymore. I wouldn't have to feel this way anymore. I was just waiting to die. But you didn't die, Dr. Foster said gently. And a grocery store clerk noticed you. She saw that you needed help and she called for it. You're alive and safe because someone paid attention and cared. That matters, Margaret. Your life matters. Margaret thought about Christina, the young woman at Save Mart who'd looked at her with concern, who'd asked if she was okay. That one moment of being seen, being noticed, being cared about, it had saved her life. I want to thank her, Margaret said. Can I do that? Detective Foster arranged a meeting between Margaret and Christina at the facility, with proper support present. When Christina arrived, Margaret started crying immediately. Thank you for seeing me. Thank you for calling. Thank you for saving my life. Christina hugged the frail woman gently. I'm just glad you're safe now. I could see in your eyes that you needed help. I couldn't ignore that. Most people did ignore it, Margaret said. For 5 years people saw me with Richard, saw how he treated me, saw that I was getting thinner and more scared. But no one said anything. You were the first person who did. Christina felt tears in her own eyes. I'm sorry it took so long for someone to notice. You deserved help much sooner, but you gave me help when it counted. I don't know if I would have survived much longer. I was giving up, but you gave me hope that people do care, that I'm not invisible, that my life has value. They talked for over an hour. Christina learned about Margaret's life before the abuse. She'd been a librarian, an avid reader, a loving mother and wife. 5 years of abuse had stripped away her identity, her joy, her sense of self. I want to be that person again, Margaret said. I want to read books and have friends and feel safe. I want to remember who I was before Richard made me believe I was worthless. You're not worthless, Christina said fiercely. You're strong. You survived 5 years of abuse. You told the truth when it was scary to do so. You're choosing to heal. That takes incredible strength, Margaret. Richard Brennan was charged with multiple counts of elder abuse, including physical abuse, emotional abuse, financial exploitation, and neglect. The evidence was substantial. Margaret's testimony about 5 years of systematic abuse, medical evidence of malnourishment, untreated injuries, and physical trauma. Financial records showing Richard controlled all of Margaret's money, her social security, pension and savings, and used significant amounts for personal expenses. Testimony from Dr. Chen about Margaret's declining health and Richard's controlling behavior during medical appointments. Christina's witness statement about what she observed at the grocery store. Evidence from the home, including a lock on the outside of Margaret's bedroom door. Richard's defense attorney tried to paint him as an overwhelmed caregiver, who'd made mistakes but hadn't been abusive. They emphasized how difficult elder care is, how stressed Richard had been, how his mother's cognitive decline made her accusations unreliable. But the prosecution had too much evidence. Margaret's cognitive decline was mild. She was fully capable of understanding and reporting abuse. The medical evidence of systematic neglect and physical injuries was undeniable. The financial exploitation was documented in bank records. The trial lasted 2 weeks. Margaret testified, describing in detail the 5 years of abuse, the fear she'd lived with, the hope that someone would notice and help. I tried to signal for help, Margaret told the jury. I'd try to tell doctors something was wrong, but Richard was always there. I'd look at neighbors, at store clerks, hoping someone would see that I was scared. For 5 years, no one did. Until Christina at the grocery store. She saw me. She cared. She called for help. She saved my life. Christina also testified about what she'd witnessed. Richard's cruelty, Margaret's fear, her physical condition, the silent plea for help in her eyes. I work retail, Christina told the jury. I see thousands of customers. Most interactions are forgettable. But this one stood out because Margaret looked so scared, so thin, so desperate, and Richard was so cruel to her. I couldn't ignore it. I had to do something. The jury deliberated for 6 hours and returned guilty verdicts on all counts. Richard Brennan was sentenced to 12 years in prison for elder abuse. At sentencing, Margaret gave a victim impact statement. My son, who I raised and loved, spent 5 years abusing me. He used my age and dependency against me. He made me believe I deserved mistreatment because I needed care. He isolated me, starved me, hurt me, and made me want to die. I lost 5 years of my life to his abuse. I lost my health, my dignity, my sense of self. But I'm getting those things back now. I'm healing. I'm remembering who I am. And I want other elderly people to know. You don't deserve abuse. Age doesn't make mistreatment acceptable. If you're being hurt, tell someone. Keep telling until someone listens. There are people who will help.
Margaret's case brought attention to elder abuse in Washington state. The story made local and national news. Grocery store clerk's vigilance saves elderly abuse victim. It sparked conversations about how often elder abuse goes unnoticed, how isolated elderly people can be, how difficult it is for victims to seek help. Christina found herself thrust into an unexpected spotlight. Media wanted interviews. Elder advocacy organizations wanted her to speak about recognizing signs of abuse. Christina was uncomfortable with the attention. "I just did what anyone should do. I saw someone who needed help, and I called for it. That shouldn't be remarkable." But elder abuse advocates explained that it was remarkable because most people didn't notice or didn't act. Elder abuse is often invisible, explained Janet Wilson from the National Center on Elder Abuse. Victims are isolated, dependent, and ashamed. They rarely ask for help directly. They need others to notice and intervene. Christina did that. She recognized signs that others had apparently missed for 5 years. Christina agreed to participate in training programs for retail workers on recognizing elder abuse. She partnered with Adult Protective Services to develop materials for employees who interact with elderly customers regularly. Grocery stores, pharmacies, banks, medical offices. You see elderly people regularly, Christina told training sessions. You're positioned to notice concerning signs, unexplained injuries, significant weight loss, fearful behavior, controlling companions who won't let them speak. If something seems wrong, trust your instincts. Call Adult Protective Services or police. You might save a life. The program, called See, Care, Act, Retail Workers Against Elder Abuse, rolled out across Washington and eventually nationwide. Major retail chains implemented the training for employees. SaveMart made the training mandatory for all employees and gave Christina a commendation for her actions. The company also implemented a protocol for employees to report concerning situations they witnessed. Margaret became an advocate as well, speaking about her experience to raise awareness about elder abuse. She partnered with organizations that helped elderly abuse victims, sharing her story to give others hope and courage to seek help. "I survived," Margaret told audiences. "I'm 78 years old. I lost 5 years to abuse. But I have time left. I'm rebuilding my life. I'm healing. And I want other elderly people in abusive situations to know it's not too late. You can escape. You can heal. You deserve better, no matter your age." Margaret and Christina formed an unlikely friendship. Despite their age difference and different backgrounds, they bonded over their shared experience and their commitment to helping other elderly abuse victims. They co-founded an organization called Never Too Late that provided resources for elderly abuse victims and training for professionals who interact with elderly people. The organization offered, for elderly people, information about recognizing abuse. Many victims don't realize their treatment is abusive, resources for seeking help safely, support groups for survivors, assistance navigating legal and social service systems. For professionals, training on recognizing signs of elder abuse, protocols for reporting concerns, resources for supporting victims, understanding barriers elderly victims face in seeking help. For families, education about caregiver stress and healthy coping strategies, resources for finding support services to prevent abuse, information about what constitutes abuse versus difficult caregiving situations. For communities, public awareness campaigns about elder abuse prevalence and signs, programs to reduce isolation of elderly people, advocacy for stronger elder protection laws and enforcement. The work was needed. Research showed that 1 in 10 elderly Americans experienced abuse, but only about 1 in 24 cases was reported to authorities. Elder abuse was hidden, underreported, and often fatal. Victims of abuse had a 300% higher risk of death than non-abused elderly people. "We're trying to make elder abuse visible," Margaret told a Senate committee hearing on elder protection. "For too long, society has ignored the mistreatment of elderly people. We're seen as burdens, as less valuable, as acceptable targets for exploitation and abuse. That needs to change. Elderly people deserve dignity, respect, and protection. Age doesn't diminish human worth." 5 years after Christina called 911 from SaveMart, the impact of that one phone call continued spreading. It had led to 342 documented cases where trained employees identified and reported elder abuse situations, resulting in investigations and interventions that removed victims from dangerous situations. One case particularly moved Christina. A pharmacist in Oregon who'd taken the training noticed an elderly man whose wife always answered questions for him and controlled all his medications. The pharmacist recognized this as a concerning sign and reported it to APS. Investigation revealed the wife was over-medicating her husband to keep him sedated and compliant, financially exploiting him, and physically abusing him. He was removed from her care and his health improved dramatically. That pharmacist saved that man because she'd been trained to recognize concerning patterns, Christina told a training session. That's what this work does. It gives people tools to recognize abuse and permission to trust their instincts and report concerns. Margaret's recovery continued steadily. She'd regained weight and strength. Her injuries had healed. She'd moved into senior living community where she had independence, safety, and social connections. She'd reconnected with old friends Richard had isolated her from. She'd returned to reading voraciously, joining book clubs, volunteering at libraries. "I have a life again," Margaret told Christina during one of their regular lunches. "For 5 years I was just surviving, just existing in fear and pain. Now I'm living. I'm enjoying things. I'm happy. That's because of you, Christina. Because you saw me and cared." Christina always deflected the credit. "You saved yourself by surviving, and by telling the truth when it was scary. I just made a phone call. That phone call changed everything," Margaret insisted. "Without it, I'd probably be dead by now. Richard's abuse was escalating. I was getting weaker. I was giving up. Your intervention saved my life, Christina. Don't minimize that." Richard remained in prison, eligible for parole in 7 years. Margaret had obtained a permanent restraining order against him. She'd also worked through complex feelings about her son, grief for the relationship they'd never have, anger at what he'd done to her, and eventual acceptance that she could love the child he'd been, while acknowledging the abuser he'd become. "I don't hate Richard," Margaret told her therapist. "I hate what he did. I'm angry about the abuse, but I also grieve for him, for the person I thought he was, for the mother-son relationship we'll never have. It's complicated, but I've learned I can hold all those feelings at once, and I've learned that loving someone doesn't mean accepting abuse from them." Christina continued working at SaveMart, but also became a sought-after trainer and speaker on elder abuse recognition. She found deep meaning in the work, knowing that every person she trained might notice the next Margaret, might make the next life-saving phone call. "I think about how close I came to not calling," Christina told audiences. "Margaret and her son were just another transaction in my line. I could have checked them out, sent them on their way, never thought about them again, but something made me pay attention. Something made me trust my instincts. Something made me act despite being unsure. That choice to pay attention, to trust my gut, to make the call changed both our lives." 10 years after that Tuesday afternoon at SaveMart, Christina Lopez and Margaret Brennan's story had created systemic changes in how society approached elder abuse prevention and intervention. Washington State had passed the Margaret Brennan Elder Protection Act, which required mandatory elder abuse awareness training for all licensed healthcare providers, caregivers, and certain retail workers. The law also increased funding for adult protective services, established a statewide elder abuse hotline, and created harsher penalties for elder abuse offenders. Similar legislation passed in 12 other states, all citing Christina and Margaret's case as inspiration. The story had demonstrated the power of ordinary citizens recognizing and reporting abuse, and the devastating consequences when abuse goes unnoticed for years. Christina, now 44, had left retail work to become a full-time trainer and advocate. She'd earned a degree in social work and worked for Never Too Late as director of community education. She traveled extensively, training retail workers, healthcare providers, bank employees, and other professionals who regularly interacted with elderly people. "Elder abuse happens in plain sight," Christina told a conference of 5,000 attendees. "Margaret came to my checkout line looking terrified, malnourished, and bruised. For 5 years she'd been in public places, grocery stores, doctor's offices, probably other locations, looking exactly the same way, but I was the first person who paid close enough attention to recognize abuse and cared enough to report it." She paused, letting that sink in. How many other Margarets are out there right now? How many elderly people are suffering abuse while the rest of us go about our business, not noticing, not caring, not acting? That's what we're trying to change. We're trying to create a society where abuse can't hide in plain sight because people are trained to recognize it and empowered to intervene. The training programs Christina helped develop had evolved significantly over the decade. They now incorporated recognition training, physical signs, unexplained injuries, poor hygiene, malnourishment, inappropriate clothing for weather, possibly hiding injuries, behavioral signs, fear of caregiver, reluctance to speak freely, withdrawal, depression, financial signs, inability to pay for necessities despite adequate income, confusion about finances, environmental signs, unsanitary living conditions, lack of necessary aids, glasses, hearing aids, walkers, intervention protocols, how to engage elderly people privately if possible, what questions to ask if abuse is suspected, how to document concerns, when and how to report to adult protective services or law enforcement, how to ensure victim safety during and after reporting, self-care for professionals, managing emotional impact of witnessing abuse, setting boundaries to prevent burnout, accessing support resources, understanding vicarious trauma,
systemic advocacy, understanding barriers elderly victims face, advocating for better elder protection laws, supporting increased funding for elder services, challenging ageist attitudes that enable abuse. The training had documented significant impact. Regions where it was widely implemented saw 67% increases in elder abuse reports, not because abuse was increasing, but because previously hidden abuse was being identified. More importantly, those reports led to interventions, investigations, and elderly victims being removed from dangerous situations and connected with support services. Margaret Brennan, now 88 years old, remained an active and passionate advocate despite her age. She'd published a memoir titled Never Too Late: My Escape from Elder Abuse and Journey to Reclaim My Life. The book became a bestseller and sparked important conversations about elder abuse, ageism, and society's treatment of elderly people. "I'm writing this book at 88 years old," Margaret wrote in the introduction. "10 years ago I thought my life was over. I thought I'd die in my son's house, abused and afraid and invisible. But a grocery store clerk saw me. She noticed my fear, my condition, my silent plea for help. She made one phone call that saved my life. Now I've had 10 years I never thought I'd have. 10 years of freedom, healing, friendship, purpose. 10 years of being alive instead of just surviving. It's never too late to escape abuse. It's never too late to heal. It's never too late to reclaim your life." The book detailed her 5 years of abuse with unflinching honesty. She described the gradual escalation from control to cruelty to violence. She described the psychological manipulation that made her believe she deserved mistreatment. She described the isolation that made her believe no one would help her. But she also described the moment Christina noticed her. She looked at me, really looked at me, and asked if I was okay. No one had asked me that in 5 years. Everyone else looked through me, past me, anywhere but at me. But Christina saw me, and she cared enough to do something about it. Margaret wrote about her recovery, the physical healing as she regained weight and strength, the emotional healing through therapy and support groups, the social healing as she rebuilt friendships and made new connections, the spiritual healing as she rediscovered joy and purpose. "Recovery from abuse isn't linear," Margaret wrote. "I still have hard days. I still sometimes have nightmares. I still sometimes feel that old fear creeping in. But those moments are less frequent now, and I have tools to manage them. I have people who support me. I have a life I love." That's what healing looks like. Not the absence of pain but the presence of joy alongside the pain. The book's final chapter was a message to elderly people experiencing abuse, and to the people who might notice and help them. If you are elderly and being abused, please know, it's not your fault. You don't deserve it. Age doesn't make abuse acceptable. Dependency doesn't justify mistreatment. You have value. Your life matters. And it's never too late to seek help. Tell someone. Keep telling until someone listens. There are people who will believe you, who will help you, who will ensure your safety. And if you are someone who interacts with elderly people, whether professionally or personally, please pay attention. Really look at the elderly people you encounter. Notice if something seems wrong. Trust your instincts. If you suspect abuse, report it. You might be the only person who notices. You might be the only chance a victim has for rescue. Please don't look away. Please care. Please act. You could save a life. The book sparked a national conversation about elder abuse. Margaret was invited to speak on talk shows, at conferences, at Senate hearings. She became the face of elder abuse awareness, using her story and her age to challenge stereotypes and demand better treatment of elderly people. "Society has this idea that elderly people are disposable," Margaret told a Senate committee, "that we're burdens, that our lives have less value than younger people's lives, that mistreating us is somehow less serious than mistreating younger people. That attitude enables abuse. It makes abusers feel justified. It makes victims feel worthless. It makes witnesses look away. We need to change how society views and treats elderly people. We need to recognize that age doesn't diminish human worth or dignity." Her advocacy contributed to federal legislation, the Elder Justice Act reauthorization, which significantly increased funding for adult protective services, elder abuse prevention programs, research and training nationwide. But the work wasn't without challenges. As awareness of elder abuse increased, so did reports, which was positive but also overwhelming for an already strained system. Adult protective services agencies across the country were inundated with reports, often lacking resources to investigate them all adequately. "We're identifying more abuse, which is good," explained Sarah Mitchell, director of a regional APS office. "But we don't have enough staff or funding to respond to everything. We're triaging, focusing on the most severe cases, the highest risk victims, but that means some cases get delayed or receive limited investigation. We need significantly more resources to match the increased reporting." Christina and Margaret advocated loudly for increased APS funding. They testified at state legislatures, lobbied Congress, raised public awareness about the resource crisis in elder protection services. "We've trained people to recognize and report elder abuse," Christina told a legislative budget committee. "That's working. reports are up significantly. But if we don't adequately fund the agencies responsible for investigating those reports and protecting victims, we're failing. We're asking people to report concerns and then not providing the resources to respond effectively. That's unacceptable. Gradually, funding increased. Not as much as needed, but progress. Several states significantly expanded APS budgets. Federal funding through the Elder Justice Act grew. The system remained imperfect and under-resourced, but it was better than it had been. Another challenge was pushback from caregiving organizations, who worried the elder abuse awareness campaigns vilified all caregivers. Most caregivers are doing their best in difficult circumstances, argued Tom Reynolds from a Family Caregivers Association. The elder abuse narrative sometimes paints all caregivers as potential abusers. That's unfair and harmful. Christina and Margaret addressed this concern in their advocacy. We're not saying all caregivers are abusive, Christina clarified in interviews. We're saying abuse happens, it's often hidden, and we need to recognize and respond to it. That's different from condemning all caregiving. In fact, one of our programs is specifically about supporting caregivers, providing resources and respite care to prevent the stress and overwhelm that can contribute to abuse. Never Too Late developed a caregiver support initiative that provided Christina Neffen, run as mad igenschätzgau tot stress to, flamy can make it tort caregivers. Back dem fight budensches trusted klagits kleids and fall of doubt them tramal of doubt ball kleid and walls initium kachem cowboats kroppel, verdites a maklids kroppel aurenchaun. What it means is we need better support systems for caregivers, so stress doesn't escalate into mistreatment. We need to make it easier for people to get help before they reach a breaking point. The program helped many caregivers manage their responsibilities without resorting to abuse. It also helped some caregivers recognize that they weren't equipped to provide adequate care and needed to explore other options like assisted living or professional in-home care. 15 years after Christina called 911, she and Margaret sat together at Christina's home, reflecting on a decade and a half of work that had grown from one moment of paying attention. Christina was now 49, Margaret was 93. Despite her age, Margaret remained mentally sharp and physically active, though she'd slowed down some. She still spoke at events occasionally but had reduced her schedule. 15 years, Margaret said, shaking her head. Sometimes it feels like yesterday. Sometimes it feels like another lifetime. Do you ever regret going public with your story? Christina asked. All the attention, the constant focus on the worst thing that happened to you. Margaret thought carefully. Sometimes. It's exhausting being a professional survivor, having my identity permanently tied to being abused. But then I think about all the people our work has helped. All the elderly abuse victims who've been identified and rescued because of training programs. All the victims who've found hope and courage through hearing my story. That makes it worth it. She looked at Christina. Do you ever regret making that call? Your life would be so different if you'd just checked us out and moved on. Christina smiled. I'd still be a grocery store cashier, probably. Which isn't a bad life, but I wouldn't have found this work, this purpose. I wouldn't have made the impact I've made. I wouldn't have met you and had this incredible friendship. So no, I don't regret it. That one phone call was the most important thing I've ever done. They sat in comfortable silence for a moment. 15 years of friendship, advocacy, and shared purpose. I think about how many people probably noticed something was wrong with me before you did, Margaret said quietly. My doctor, neighbors, other store clerks, maybe family friends who'd seen me occasionally. How many people saw signs that I was being abused but didn't say anything, didn't want to get involved, told themselves it wasn't their business? Christina nodded. I think about that too. How many Margarets are out there right now being noticed by people who choose not to act? How many are suffering because people don't want the inconvenience or discomfort of reporting concerns? That's why the training matters, Margaret said. It gives people permission and tools to act on their instincts. It makes intervention feel like responsibility instead of intrusion. They reviewed the impact data from Never Too Late, where 200,000 professionals trained in elder abuse recognition. 1,847 documented cases where trained individuals identified and reported abuse. Estimated 5,000 plus additional cases indirectly influenced by increased awareness. Increased national funding for elder protection services. Measurable improvements in elder abuse identification and intervention rates. One phone call, Christina said, looking at the numbers. One moment of paying attention. 15 years of ripples. Your moment of paying attention saved my life, Margaret said. And then we used that moment to build something that saved hundreds of other lives. That's legacy, Christina. That's what one person caring enough to act can become. As Christina and Margaret aged and began thinking about succession, they focused on developing the next generation of advocates and leaders for Never Too Late. They created a fellowship program that brought young professionals into elder abuse prevention work. Fellows spent a year learning about elder abuse, developing prevention strategies, conducting training, and working directly with survivors. One fellow, Maria Rodriguez, had a personal connection to the issue. Her grandmother had been financially exploited by a caregiver before Maria's family discovered and stopped it. I watched what that exploitation did to my grandmother, Maria told Christina. The shame, the loss of independence, the violation of trust. I want to prevent other families from experiencing that. Maria eventually became Never Too Late's executive director, taking over day-to-day operations as Christina transitioned to a senior advisor role. Under Maria's leadership, the organization continued growing and evolving. Another fellow, James Chen, developed a technology solution, an app that allowed concerned individuals to anonymously report suspected elder abuse, and connected elderly people with resources and support. The app included educational materials about recognizing abuse, hotline numbers, and guided documentation tools for those wanting to report concerns. Technology can amplify our reach, James explained. Not everyone can attend in-person training, but millions of people have smartphones. If we can provide elder abuse education and reporting tools through an app, we can empower more people to recognize and respond to abuse. The app, called Age with Dignity, was downloaded over 500,000 times in its first year. It led to thousands of reports to Adult Protective Services and connected numerous elderly people directly with support resources. The next generation brought fresh perspectives and innovations while honoring the foundational work Christina and Margaret had built. They expanded the organization's focus beyond just abuse that had already occurred to prevention, addressing root causes like caregiver stress, ageism, isolation, and inadequate elder care infrastructure. Christina and Margaret showed us what's possible when one person pays attention and acts, Maria told her team. But we need to move beyond just responding to abuse. We need to prevent it from happening in the first place. That means changing how society views and treats elderly people. That means building better support systems for both elderly people and caregivers. That's the work ahead of us. 20 years after Christina made that phone call from SaveMart, she and Margaret were jointly awarded the Presidential Medal of Freedom for their work combating elder abuse and protecting vulnerable elderly Americans. Standing in the White House at ages 54 and 98 respectively, Christina and Margaret accepted the nation's highest civilian honor with humility and emotion. 20 years ago, the president said during the ceremony, Christina Lopez was a grocery store cashier who noticed an elderly woman being mistreated and chose to act. Margaret Brennan was that elderly woman, surviving 5 years of abuse and hoping someone would notice. Their chance encounter, one person paying attention, one person finding courage to seek help, sparked a movement that has protected thousands of elderly Americans and transformed how our society recognizes and responds to elder abuse. After the ceremony, reporters asked Christina the inevitable question, how does it feel to be a national hero? Christina gave the same answer she'd been giving for 20 years. I'm not a hero. I'm a person who saw someone in trouble and called for help. That should be normal, not heroic. The real hero is Margaret, who survived 5 years of abuse and then used that experience to help others. The real heroes are the thousands of professionals who've been trained and who pay attention every day, who recognize abuse and report it. I just made one phone call 20 years ago. Margaret was asked what she wanted her legacy to be. I want people to remember that it's never too late, she said. Never too late to escape abuse. Never too late to seek help. Never too late to rebuild your life. I was 78 when I was rescued. I thought my life was over. But I've had 20 wonderful years since then. 20 years of freedom, purpose, friendship, joy. If my story gives even one elderly person hope that they can escape their situation and rebuild, that's enough. The medal ceremony brought renewed attention to elder abuse issues. Donations to elder protection organizations increased. More states passed protective legislation. Public awareness grew. But for Christina and Margaret, the real meaning wasn't in the recognition. It was in the quiet individual successes. The elderly woman in Ohio whose neighbor noticed bruises and called APS. The elderly man in Texas whose bank teller recognized financial exploitation and reported it. The elderly woman in Florida whose pharmacist saw signs of abuse and intervened. Each one a life saved because someone paid attention and acted.
Margaret Brennan passed away peacefully, in her sleep, at age 101, 23 years after Christina Lopez noticed her in a grocery store checkout line and made the phone call that saved her life. Her memorial service was attended by hundreds, family friends she'd reconnected with, fellow advocates she'd worked alongside, survivors she'd inspired, professionals she'd trained, and Christina, who'd become family over 2 decades of friendship and shared purpose. Christina gave the eulogy, her voice thick with emotion. 23 years ago, Margaret was 78 years old, and certain her life was over. She was being abused by her son. She was malnourished, terrified, and hopeless. She came through my checkout line at SaveMart looking for help but unable to ask for it directly. I saw her fear, I saw her suffering, and I made a phone call. Christina looked at the crowd. That phone call led to Margaret's rescue. But what happened after is what really defined her. Margaret could have quietly rebuilt her life in private. Instead, she chose to go public. She chose to share her story, no matter how painful. She chose to use her experience to help others. For 23 years, she was a fierce advocate for elderly people. She changed laws. She educated thousands. She inspired countless abuse victims to seek help. She showed the world that elder abuse is real, that it matters, and that we all have a responsibility to recognize and respond to it. Christina's voice broke. Margaret gave me 23 years of friendship, wisdom, and purpose. She taught me that age doesn't diminish a person's value or capacity for impact. She was making a difference at 90, at 95, at 100 years old. She proved that it's never too late to rebuild, to heal, to matter. I'm grateful every day that I noticed her 23 years ago, that I trusted my instincts, that I made that call, because it gave Margaret 23 years she never thought she'd have, and it gave me a friendship and a purpose that transformed my life. After the service, attendees shared memories. The elderly woman from Ohio, who'd been rescued because her neighbor had learned to recognize abuse through never-too-late training. The APS worker who'd been inspired to specialize in elder protection after hearing Margaret speak. The caregiver who'd sought help managing stress before it escalated into abuse, thanks to resources never too late provided. The grandmother who'd found courage to report her son's financial exploitation after reading Margaret's memoir. Story after story, life after life. The ripples from one grocery store transaction, one phone call, 2 decades of advocacy. In Margaret's will, she left her estate to Never Too Late to continue the work she and Christina had built. She also left a letter to be read at the organization's next board meeting. To the board and staff of Never Too Late, if you're reading this, I've passed on. I hope I made it to at least 100. That seemed like a good milestone. I want you to know that the past 20+ years working with this organization have been the most meaningful of my life. I spent 78 years being a librarian, a wife, a mother. Those roles were important, but the years after my rescue, the years I spent as an advocate, trying to protect other elderly people from what I experienced, those were the years I felt I truly mattered. Elder abuse is a hidden epidemic. Elderly people are abused in homes, facilities, and communities across this country every single day. They're abused by family members who should protect them, by caregivers who should care for them, by institutions that should serve them. They're abused because society views them as less valuable, less important, more disposable than younger people. Your work, our work, is to make elder abuse visible, to give elderly people voices, to demand they be treated with dignity and respect, to ensure that age doesn't diminish human worth. I was lucky. Christina noticed me when countless others had looked past me for 5 years. She cared when others didn't. She acted when others wouldn't. That luck shouldn't be necessary. Every elderly person in crisis should be noticed, should be helped, should be protected. That's what we're working toward. Continue the training, continue the advocacy, continue the support services, continue fighting for policy changes and increased funding, continue making noise about this issue until society can't ignore it anymore. And remember, it's never too late. Never too late to escape abuse, never too late to seek help, never too late to rebuild, never too late to make a difference. I started this work at 78. I continued it past 100. Age is not a limitation, it's just a number. Thank you for carrying this work forward. Thank you for believing elderly people matter. Thank you for being the people who notice, who care, who act. With love and gratitude, Margaret Brennan. Christina read the letter through tears. 23 years of friendship, advocacy, and shared purpose. 23 years of impact stemming from one moment in a grocery store checkout line. The work continued. Never Too Late kept training professionals, educating the public, supporting survivors, and advocating for systemic changes. Under Maria Rodriguez's leadership, the organization expanded internationally, adapting elder abuse recognition and intervention programs for different cultural contexts. Christina, now approaching 60, gradually stepped back from active work, but remained connected as a senior advisor and occasional speaker. She'd spent over 2 decades telling the story of that Tuesday afternoon at Save Mart when she noticed an elderly woman in distress and made the choice to act. I tell this story over and over, Christina said at her final keynote speech before retiring, and people always say you're a hero or that was extraordinary. But I want you to understand something. What I did wasn't extraordinary. I noticed someone in trouble and I called for help. That's something anyone can do. That's something everyone should do. She looked at the audience of several thousand. The extraordinary part wasn't me making a phone call. The extraordinary part was what Margaret did with her rescue. She was 78 years old when she escaped abuse. She could have quietly lived out her remaining years in peace. Instead, she became a fierce advocate. She shared her painful story publicly. She fought to protect others. She created systemic change. She proved that age doesn't limit impact or purpose. That's extraordinary. Christina's voice grew passionate. Margaret's dead now, but her legacy lives on in every professional trained to recognize elder abuse, every policy changed to better protect elderly people, every victim who found courage to seek help after hearing her story, every life saved because someone paid attention and acted. She paused. I made one phone call 23 years ago.
It took 3 minutes. It changed 2 lives completely and touched thousands more indirectly. That's the power we all have. The power to notice, the power to care, the power to act. Use that power. Pay attention to the vulnerable people around you. Trust your instincts when something seems wrong. Make the call. You never know what ripples might spread from one moment of caring. The standing ovation lasted 15 minutes. Afterward, hundreds of people approached Christina with their own stories. Elderly people they'd helped after Christina's training, abuse situations they'd recognized and reported, lives they'd changed by paying attention. Each story reminded Christina of why that Tuesday afternoon phone call had mattered, why trusting her instincts had been right, why Margaret's courage to tell her story and fight for others had created lasting change. 23 years, 1 checkout line interaction, 2 lives transformed, thousands protected, 1 grocery store clerk who noticed, 1 elderly woman who was seen, 1 phone call that sparked a movement. That was enough. More than enough. Everything. This story is dedicated to every person who pays attention to vulnerable elderly people, who recognizes when something seems wrong, and who has the courage to report concerns and seek help for those who can't help themselves. Your vigilance saves lives. And to every elderly person experiencing abuse, you deserve better. It's not your fault, and it's never too late to seek help and rebuild your life.
Thank you very much for listening. Please let us know what you think of this story in the comments. Don't forget to like the video and subscribe to the channel. Turn on notifications so you don't miss any other videos.